Hi, everyone. It's good to see everyone, and it's good to be able to provide this update specifically on Métis rights. I think that one of the things that people don't quite recognize is how much work you have all done over the years and how it's also finally coming to fruition through the negotiated agreements that President Potre is talking about, but also where you're going next. I think that the courts have been your vehicle over the last decade. Instead of turning to the battlefields, we've been in the courts fighting. And I think that through those successes, we finally are at a place where you're able to complete Riel's vision, and the basis that we all have worked on for so many years is that Métis are an Indigenous people with the inherent right to self-determination and self-government that needs to be respected in the lands that we were born on in what is now Canada. And I'm just going to highlight some of the history and case law that goes into that, because there's always that saying, if you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going. And I think people need to understand just how much work has been done, not by just the people in this room, but your ancestors who fought and died, and Riel and others who in 1869 and 70 decided, no, we're going to declare a provisional government. We're not going to wait for it to be handed to us, and we're going to push back on it. And that Métis spirit continues today. So I'm just going to start with why the Métis have inherent rights. It's because we're a people. We have our own origin story, a shared history, a distinct culture and way of life, a language, a territory, and we identified as a people, not 20 minutes after a court decision came down, but continually since our birth as a nation in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And that is what anchors our nationhood, and that is what anchors your self-government today. And you can never lose sight of that. And you can never also allow governments to try to chop us up, bulldoze over us, ignore us, or play divide and conquer. And those elements are what grounds our nationhood and makes us a people. And we span from parts of Ontario all the way to parts of British Columbia and the Northwest Territories and in to the northern United States. And that territory, with our communities that we all come from, many of us connect back to the Red River, but also many of us identify our geography I come from northwestern Ontario, a commercial fishing family there. Many will identify you come from Lac Saint Anne or Cadott Lake, and you are part of the larger Métis Nation, but we are a people of place, born of those communities that combine to make our nation. We are not just of one place or of one location where our families have essentially lived for generations, and we are a part of the land, and as President Potre mentioned, the first Canadians of these lands. These geographies are what hold our nation together today, but those geographies are just as important to our nation as the larger nation and those individual communities. And what has bound us together is whether it's trade, commerce, water routes, watersheds, kinship connections, relationships with each other. That is what anchors the Métis Nation within Alberta, but it also anchors the larger Métis Nation. And I just want to highlight this, of that many, some put forward a narrative that everything began and begat in Red River and we're all diaspora. And that simply isn't the case. The Supreme Court of Canada has recognized in cases that the communities here in Alberta were here well before 1869 and 70. Here's one where they say, around the time of the negotiations, the Métis population in the Red River numbered roughly 9,000. The Métis populations in territories outside the colony was still significant. It numbered more than 2,000. The Métis communities outside the colony included Lac La Biche, Peace River, St. Albert, Slave Lake, and were well established and dynamic. The Métis who settled in these outlying areas maintained strong family connections to the settlement of the Red River and traveled frequently to the colony. In fact, there was an extensive travel throughout the territories generally, as trading activities along with the bison hunt were mainstays of the economy. The Métis often wintered in different locations throughout the territory. And I just want to say that I've done about 5 cases, spent over a year of my life listening to elders, community leaders, harvesters in those court cases, talking about those communities here in Alberta that are just as important as those in Saskatchewan, those in Manitoba, and those in other parts of the Métis Nation. And I think that it's really important that those stories, that is what grounds your rights. I want to say this, in some of those court cases, the Crown kept on saying, well, there's no Métis in our backyard. There may be Métis in Manitoba. And what we had to prove in those court cases is, no, there's Métis here in Alberta. There's Métis here in Saskatchewan. There's Métis here in those other locations. And I think it's really important that you never want, while we do come from a common narrative and a shared story, the geographies that we have, where our communities come from, where our families are, where we know our lands, where we know our lakes, where we know our territories, that's just more, if not more important than the larger Métis Nation. Because that is what holds the Métis Nation together. It's those communities. And of course, in Alberta, well, we weren't successful in the Hersecorn case, and I'm looking forward to the resolution to going back at it because we have the facts, and bad law was made in that case. But even in that case, the court recognized that the evidence showed a historical Métis community existed in the region around present-day Edmonton and District. The group of North Saskatchewan Métis included settlements at Fort Edmonton, St. Albert's, Lac-Saint-Anne, Victoria, Lac-La-Biche, Rocky Mountain House. The Métis people in this region had a distinctive collective identity, lived together in the same geographic area, and shared a common way of life. And those communities and that regional diversity is what actually brings our nation strength. It doesn't undermine our nation in any way, shape, or form. It is how we know each other. It is how we move throughout the Métis Nation historically and today. And it's those lands and those relationships that anchors your rights. I never want to get into a position, as I've said in some of those court cases, the Crown used to say, well, whatever rights the Métis have, they're in Manitoba. We never want to advance a narrative that essentially pulls the rug out from under our historic communities that are here in this province and throughout other places of the Métis Nation. And I want to highlight this. This is what the map of Canada should look like about where different languages, different peoples are. And we're coming out of a long history within Canada of colonization, and people don't understand what that means. We've been all, in many cases, fed lies through our education system, told untruths from the church and other institutions that always thought our people, our families were inferior to mainstream society, to people who didn't look like us, for people who didn't live like us. And what Canada's narrative, and you see these maps sometimes, and I use this as education because you have to question these maps. This is the map of Canada, where the Michif language lived, where the language of other First Nation peoples lived, where Métis communities and Indigenous peoples lived. And then these are the maps that his story, and his story is usually a story written by old white guys, that they get to tell the story. They get to draw these maps, and what they do in that process is they erase us from the map. So this is how they show the story. Oh, well, this is where Canada is in the east, and this is Northwest Territories, Rupert's Land, and we're going to just steamroll over that or take claim to it, and it will become our story, where we know the reality is our story is what comes from those lands. And this is, I always love this quote because it shows the difference of perspective. This is Louis Riel's perspective, and he's writing in 1885 in a prison cell. And he said, when the government of Canada presented itself at our doors, it found us at peace. It found the Métis people of the Northwest could not only live well without it, but it had a government of its own, free, peaceful, well-functioning, contributing to the work of civilization in a way the company from England could never have done with 1,000 soldiers. It was a government with an organized constitution whose junction was more legitimate and worthy of respect because it was exercised over the country that it belonged to. Think about that. Riel's saying that in 1885. That's the bias. Canada was not supposed to be a bulldozer. Canada was supposed to be allowed to reconcile diversity within unity. But what it's done to Indigenous people is often act like a bulldozer. It assumes it has jurisdictions. Provincial laws, federal laws, no place for Indigenous law, language, and jurisdiction, which is born of this land, not passed by Ottawa or from others. And I think that's extremely important. Those are the words of Riel, which are honorable and amazing still today. These are the words of Sir John A. Macdonald in 1869. It will require a considerable management to keep those wild people quiet. In another year, the present residents will be altogether swamped by the influx of strangers who will go about with the idea of becoming industrious and peaceable settlers. You're those wild people, just so you know. And they didn't keep us quiet, and they thought they could assimilate, and they thought they could keep us down, but that's never going to happen. And the work that you do in relation to self-government is all about making sure that never happens. This is how Canada, that colonial, his story, looks like. There's provincial laws and jurisdiction, and then there's federal laws and jurisdiction. And there's no place for us. You don't see us in that narrative. This is what the reality is. We all have our own sovereignties, and we pool our jurisdictions together to create Canada. And without us, Canada's nothing. Canada's a fraud. It doesn't have, its constitution is not legitimate because the Indigenous peoples who are the first peoples of this land are not a part of that constitution. And that is what, when we're talking about a constitution and Métis law, is we're saying we're exercising and we're taking up that space, and you're going to have to reconcile with us. Not that we have to reconcile with your jurisdictions and laws anymore, but we have to figure out a way that this works together through accommodation, through harmonization. And what Canada has done with us over the years is it's called, like, they handed out, old white guys should get it. It's like this little old colonization toolkit, right? It's got an eraser in it. Okay, well, we'll erase the maps. Instead, in my home community, instead of the lake that we all know it as, you know what it gets named as and what everyone refers to it? The white lady that came with the original settler. That's what it's known as now. It's called Fort Frances because it's named after some lady who just arrived, as opposed to the lake that we know it as. And that's what happens. Those geographies are erased. Our place on the map is erased. In Manitoba, the promise was to get 22% of the land within the old postage stamp province. Well, you know what old Sir John A. did? He made sure that it was delayed, and a reign of terror happened in that territory, and that promise was not fulfilled. Canada got what it wanted, but then it never held up its part of the deal. And then you said, well, we stole it fair and square, we got away with it. You know what they went on and did? Scrip, which is the next fraud perpetuated on our people. And from that is the largest land swindle in North America from a documentary perspective. And you know what? Many Canadians don't even know about it. They don't even know about how they stole Western Canada from First Nations as well as the Métis. And while First Nations have done a good job at increasing knowledge about their treaties and that story, we have to tell the story about scrip. It has not been told yet. It is not understood thoroughly. And there will be no reconciliation with the Métis without dealing with the issue of Métis scrip. And here's what your ancestors did, whether it's in Cypress Hills in southern Alberta, or in St. Albert, or in Lesser Slave Lake, or in Fort Res, Fort Smith, or Fort Chip. You're petitioning and saying, this stinks. This system is fraudulent. This system isn't working. And you know what his story does, so those old white guys? They amend the criminal code so your ancestors can't even go to court to prosecute the fraud that was perpetuated against them. So you know when people always talk about, the stories about how, well, First Nations couldn't even go retain lawyers? You know what they did in the Métis case? They just amended the criminal code through some of the largest land speculators in Alberta, advancing it through their buddies through the Senate. That's the story of Canada. And so what happens to the Métis when you need to understand our narrative of going from the partners in Confederation or the brokers and diplomats of the plains and becoming the road allowance people within one generation? It's because of script. It's because of that colonization toolkit where they dispossess and they take control through their laws, fraudulent as they are, instead of honoring the people that were actually here. And here's what that map's looked like when it's in full effect. Those provinces, territories, and no place for us. Absolutely no place. So we fight back, and one of your great leaders, I love this quote from him, it's Jim Brady, and he just says this. He goes, when you don't have bullets, when the courts don't work for you, you know what you do? You organize. And that's what you did in Alberta. In the 1900s, you're organizing. You're saying, we got nothing else. You don't have pennies to your name, but you come together and you form the MNA, the Métis Association of Alberta, the Federation of Métis Settlements, and you read these stories about people going to meetings, one person having to pay to bring their, get paid to bring their typewriter to type out the outcomes of the stories. And it's meetings like this, kitchen tables, around campfires, around community meetings and assemblies, where you build what you have today, brick by brick, in the face of colonization's toolkit. And the creation of our Métis governments, this is what you do. Now, here's the big issue, and people can slag you, and I just say it's total bullshit. Because when they say, oh, you're nothing but an association, we created associations because there was no other legal tool for us to use. That is why, so here's this. If we just said, look, we're a Métis government, we're going to organize like this, no governments would provide you any funding, no governments would recognize you, they wouldn't even say you exist. So what was done is you use a legal tool over in the provincial jurisdictions and laws called the Alberta Societies Act and bylaws to at least create a vehicle to advance your self-government. And people can slag that as much as they want, but those are just as legitimate of Métis governments as what Riel created in 1869 and 70. And anyone who says differently is full of it and doesn't know what real government looks like. Because Métis government is more democratic than any Canadian system I've ever seen. Believe me, I've been yelled at enough at assemblies to know that is democracy in action, and you've got to listen to people, and you've got to find ways through. And so what you really have, though, is you've never exercised in your own circle of Indigenous government, of the law and the jurisdiction you have as a people. And that flows, no one gives it to you. You don't even have to go ask. That flows from your inherent rights as one of the successors to the Métis Nation and as a Métis government. And then what you then do is you negotiate based upon that strength and based upon that inherent constitution with governments, as opposed to, oh my God, if I have to go to one more meeting where I have to hear Robert's Rules of Order in the Métis Nation, I will be very much looking forward to when we are talking about Métis laws and the Métis way of doing things, as opposed to, I don't even know who this guy Robert is, but somehow he's very important in our assemblies often. And what our leaders thought in 1982 is we were going to change all that. That Harry Daniels, who used to be on the Métis Nation of Alberta Provincial Council and was able to secure Métis in the Constitution, and we thought are existing rights, and I want to emphasize why we say existing, because no one's giving them to you. You already had them. And that's what Section 35 is about, that those existing rights are protected, and that Section 35's purpose for the Métis is for us to be able to negotiate a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship with Canada as equals, not as supplicants, not as wards, not as children, but as equals. And these agreements will recognize Métis governments as distinct Indigenous governments in Canadian law with their own inherent jurisdictions that flow from Métis laws, not because some government says you can do something. And so after 1982, and this is one of my photos, because I refer to it as this, and I don't want to be facetious, but it's kind of like, you know, Lucy and Charlie Brown in the football. Your leaders have constantly used every political process available to them, and essentially the government of Canada, because they're often cowards and they're often dishonorable, play Lucy, and they take the football away when you think you're so close. So in the 1980s, there were the constitutional conferences in the 1980s. Those were unsuccessful. Many of you may have seen that video of Jim Sinclair essentially telling the government of Canada leaders to go F themselves. It was quite a sight to be seen, but I love watching that video because what he said is he goes, "I don't care if you don't agree with us, but we'll be back and we're not going anywhere." And with the Métis Nation Accord in the 1990s, we came close again as a part of the Charlottetown Accord. Many of you were a part of that. M&A was a fundamental part of that, along with the Métis National Council and other Métis governments, and that was slipped away as well. And then Canada did its Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and issued a report called Gathering Strength, which I refer to as Gathering Dust, and it didn't include anything about the Métis. And you know what we finally do then? We just say, we're turning to the courts. We're done. You guys are dishonorable. You're not going to implement Section 35 in an honorable way. And we also learned from our cousins, First Nations, who had already gone to the courts. Because in the First Nations world, those treaties that we all know, no one used to pay attention to them either. First Nations had to turn to the courts to get those treaties recognized as agreements that need to be implemented and honored just as much as other parts of Canada's Constitution. And also from 1921, they stopped negotiating modern-day treaties, or treaties in parts of the country where Indigenous land claims still existed. And so in cases like Calder and Sparrow and Vanderpeet, the First Nations went to the courts and they changed things. So that's where those historic treaties are, and through going to the courts, modern-day treaties began to be negotiated in other areas of the country. And here's some of those modern-day treaties. And here's where some of those modern-day treaties are still, other treaties or self-government agreements are still being negotiated with First Nations. And this is what that map began to look like. They were changing it. But you know what the problem with this map is? The Métis Nation's rights and interests still haven't been dealt with. And that's the remaining piece. And that is what we have been working on in your self-government discussions, in your constitution development, and in also going to the courts. So we took a page out of the First Nation successes. MMF filed the MMF land claim agreement, the MMF land claim case. In the 1990s, test cases on Métis harvesting rights were taken to the court. Harry Daniels initiates the case about who has jurisdiction for us. And in 2003, Powley case comes down, and it affirms that Métis in Sault Ste. Marie area have a Section 35 right to hunt for food. But Powley is more than that. Powley says that Métis are full-fledged rights holders as a distinct rights-bearing people, and their rights are equal to those of First Nations. Equal, not some subordinate or some derivative of First Nations. The court also emphasizes that, sure, you don't have Indian Act bans, and determining who may be a member of a community, of an Indian Act band, of who may be a member of a Métis community, this does not detract from the status of the Métis people as full-fledged rights bearers. As Métis communities continue to organize themselves more formally and assert their constitutional rights, it's imperative that membership requirements become more standardized so legitimate rights holders can be identified. And that hard work you've done with your registry of 53,000, 54,000 proud, and more coming each day, and going through I've been to many of your assemblies where you had to cancel those old red and white cards that some people didn't have completed files, but now you're stronger as a government because you did that hard work, and that's why Canada's recognizing you, and you're deciding who are rights holders, not governments like what happens in the Indian Act regime. And in the Cunningham case in 2011, the court says, caught between two larger identities and cultures, the Métis have struggled for more than 2 centuries for recognition of their own unique identity, culture, and governance. The constitutional amendments signal the time has finally come for recognition of Métis as a unique and distinct people. And in 2013, the Manitoba Métis Federation case comes down, and they say, the unfinished business of the reconciliation of the Métis people with Canadian sovereignty is a matter of national and constitutional import. And last but not least, in 2016, Daniel's case says, Section 9124 of the Constitution Act is about the federal government's relationship with Canada's Aboriginal peoples. Métis are Indians under Section 9124, and it is the federal government to whom they can turn. And it's all done. And that is the cases that you turn to the courts, and you won every single time. And it's because the facts of history on your side, and it's because Canada hasn't honored the promise of Section 35. Now, what you have had is a new beginning of negotiations, and you've seen many of those agreements since 2017, a new federal government in place in 2015, the MOU being signed to start negotiations, a formal framework agreement signed in November 2017, your consultation agreement in 2018, in 2018, the Canada Parks Open Doors MOU, your negotiated settlement with Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and last but not least is the MGRSA. And President Patra is going to finish off talking about that, but I just want to highlight this. This is the culmination, in all those court cases that we did, court cases don't matter because you are the ones that have to consolidate the court cases. What some old judge says doesn't change anyone's life that day. What changes people's lives is what you're able to negotiate as outcomes of those court cases, whether it's your harvesting agreement, whether it's your self-government agreement, whether it's all the work you continue to do. And where you're now at is moving from that association and bylaws, and you finally have a government at the federal level who's willing to sit down and negotiate with you. But you've got to do your work. And your work is this. You've got to finally move out of that colonial, paternalistic Societies Act and pass your own laws, which you act upon, based upon Métis self-government. And then in that middle, you will see your self-government agreement that will be constitutionally protected, which is how Canada will interface with your laws and respect some of your laws. In some areas, such as citizenship, your elections, your laws will have greater priority than Canada's laws. And that's fundamentally important because those are the laws that should be respected on those issues, not what the federal government may say. And I think that a Métis Constitution is fundamental to that. You'll no longer be under the legal constraints of the Alberta Societies Act, which hinder true Métis self-government in a whole host of ways. I want to emphasize that constitutions are never perfect. Hey, you're Métis Albertans. What do you think about Canada's constitution? Is it perfect? I don't think so. It's a work in progress, but constitutions can be amended. And most importantly, many of the specifics in the Constitution are dealt with in laws that you can the first step is you need to set out a constitution that carves out your constitutional space. The benefits are immense, that the inherent right to self-government is recognized. There can be no future loosies pulling the rug out from under you in the future. Alberta will be forced to recognize you as a government because Canada will have passed its law on that issue. and that you're no longer obtaining your legal status from provincial laws. Your authorities are recognized as inherent authorities. You get to decide how you exercise it. Your district councils would be recognized as having full self-government powers, ability to hold lands, recognized as being responsible for consultation and accommodation, direct seat on the Citizenship Council, etc. And in particular, fiscal. Canada has never funded you on the basis that they do for First Nations, and they've never funded you on an expenditure need basis. With a self-government treaty, modern-day self-government agreement, all the other groups get their agreements based on expenditure need and that their governments are funded directly. Right now, the MNA doesn't have the capacity to do that or the ability to do that because Ottawa sets the rules, and transferring those funds out to locals could essentially put the MNA in a position where it can't deliver on the rules set by a contribution agreement. That won't be the case once you get to a fiscal financing agreement. There'll also be a tax agreement that needs to be arranged. And the long-term benefits are that it avoids, after years of organizing, you're finally on a nation-to-nation basis. And in particular, you have a window here. The current federal government is getting long in the tooth. It's 7 years in. You can see the writing on the wall and what may happen. And I'll use a line of, make hay while the sun shines. And there is a window here to finally complete Riel's dream and complete the dream of what your ancestors want. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over. But thanks for your time, and it's always great to be able to talk to you.